The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process. Welcome back to The Process. It is 2022. You made it. Not only to part 2 of season 3, but also through the craziness that has been the last few years. So welcome. Hopefully you're not listening to this 30 years in the future from some dystopian bunker, but rather you're in the comfort of your own home, maybe sipping some tea or possibly doing your laundry. I think you're really going to enjoy part 2 of season 3, as we have a lot of amazing guests lined up for the remainder of the season. And what better way to start that trend off than to talk to legendary composer Elizabeth Rahm today, as well as new music advocate and flute performer Jay Marsh, as well as one of the classical, or one of the recording geniuses behind a lot of the classical music coming out of Toronto in Canada, Robert DeVito. This is one of those episodes where I wish the format of this podcast was like 3 hours long, because we could just, we could really deep dive into things. And as you know, I often talk about the creative cogitations towards the end of each episode. And towards the end, Robert actually brought up one of the classic questions, and we were about to actually end the interview, and he requested that we kind of address this one, and everyone else was interested in it as well and weighed in, and that was the starving artist trope. And I think half of you now are probably like, oh yeah, let's talk about that, and the other half maybe are just sighing in disappointment, like, do we really have to talk about this again? And that's sort of the way I feel about it. I feel like, yeah, this is something we need to talk about and address, this idea of the starving artist. But I'm also just so bored and so tired of it, because it tends to be this sort of kind of corrosive trope that I'm not really sure who made it up. Is it artists who are struggling and are kind of resentful of that? Or is it just kind of like a business kind of capitalist mindset that doesn't understand the value of art, or can't quantify it, or in general why you would suffer doing anything? I'll let the experts be the voices for this discussion. So without further ado, let's learn more about Elizabeth, Jay, and Robert, and hear excerpts from Northern Lights on the Flute in the Wild album on the Center Discs label. Elizabeth Rahm's works have been heard throughout North America, Europe, South America, China, Japan, and Russia. She has also written for film and video and has won numerous awards for her scores in this genre. She has been commissioned by such prestigious organizations as the Winnipeg Ballet, the Calgary Philharmonic, Symphony Nova Scotia, the Nexus Percussion Ensemble, the Ottawa International Chamber Music Festival, and the St. Lawrence String Quartet. Her opera, The Garden of Alice, has recently been filmed by the Pacific Opera Victoria with Tracy Dahl singing the lead role. Her works have been featured on over 40 commercial CDs, including How Bodies Leave Ecstatic Marks, which was the winning entry for Best Classical Composition for the 2008 Western Music Award. In 2004, she was awarded an honorary doctorate in Humane Letters from Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. In November 2010, she was given the Saskatchewan Order of Merit, and in 2013, the Canadian Composer Award for the Canadian Band Association. She is included in the New Groves Dictionary of Music and Musicians, the New Grove Dictionary of Opera, and the New Groves Dictionary of Women Composers, as well as numerous other publications. Recently, Rahm completed several flute works as part of an international online flute festival, Flute Music by Women Composers, organized in part by the Scarborough Philharmonic Orchestra in collaboration with Heidi K. Begay of Flute 360 podcast, as well as she was commissioned by flutist Jay Marsh to write 2 major works for flute, harp, and bassoon for her newly released CD, Flute in the Wild. Jay Marsh is a Canadian flutist and is the driving force behind the Factor-funded Flute in the Wild project, new music that takes you into the wild spaces of Canada through a flute lens. The recording is being carried on the Center Discs label, and the project was recently awarded grants from the Canadian Council of the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council. Robert DeVito is the creative director and lead engineer of Society of Sound. The Toronto-based production company has worked with clients like Universal Music, BMG Music, Sony Music, EMI, and many others. Society of Sound has collaborated with ensembles like the Canadian Brass, the Toronto Symphony, the Canadian Opera Company, and the National Ballet of Canada. In 2016, Robert was nominated for a Juno under Record of the Year for classical albums and in the category Large Ensemble. On today's episode, we hear excerpts from Elizabeth Rahm's Northern Lights, featuring Jay Marsh on flute, Heidi Elise Bearcroft on harp, and percussion by Andrew Morris. The album Flute in the Wild is carried on the Center Discs label. Elizabeth, let's start with where the creative process begins for you.
Oh, let's see now.
Yeah.
That's always a little bit of a mystery. I'll have a vague idea of what I want to do. And if I think about it enough, it's like, have you ever gone to sleep on a problem and you wake up and the answer's there? It's very much like that. So I start out with wanting to write something. Northern Lights. I'm not even sure how I started that. That was a kind of a rewrite of another piece. But when I started that for years ago, I wanted to write something. It was for a dancer and for a flute player, a friend of mine, and tape. That was a long time ago. It was tape.
Yes, yeah. I still call it tape.
Oh, good. Okay. So it just it has its own life. It kind of grows as you go along. A little bit like dreaming in a way, but putting notes to a dream. Usually when you dream, you forget what you dreamed, but you have to hurry up and do it. In fact, sometimes I'll get a great idea, and if I don't write it down, it's gone.
Yeah, that instantaneous idea.
Yeah,
and then it's ephemeral.
Yeah.
Where does that begin when you're trying to capture, the butterfly in the jar? Where is that happening? Is that happening in front of the piano? Is that happening in front of a computer? Where does that initial process begin?
In the old days, it happened in front of the piano.
Yeah.
And some people have the ability to have the kind of ear where they can write and, they get it from their head. I need a keyboard.
Sure.
And it happens in front of the piano. Now, I was in a situation where I had to write very quickly. And I had learned finale. The fellow asked me to write him sonata, and I didn't have time. So I figured if I do it on the computer, I can copy and paste. And that'll take, that's so much faster. And that's when I first started using the computer. I didn't think I could because it was so mechanical that I thought, that's taking away from what's internal. When you use the keyboard and you use your hand and your pencil, that's internal. But with a computer, you're thinking about what keys to push. Well, darn if I didn't switch over. And now I have to do, your brain. It's like, they have these glasses where you're twisted around. And after a while, the people see things right. And then when they take them off, this has been an experiment, everything's upside down again.
Right.
And that's what kind of happened was I just became much more comfortable with the computer, although I always have to play things again on the keyboard, on the piano, because there's something about the vibrations of my fingers tell me when it's right. And a piano, and it can't be an electronic piano, it has to be an acoustic piano.
Yeah, the physicality of it.
Yeah, well, and I think it's the vibrations.
So, Jay, where ideally do you like to join the creative process?
Well, I like to be there kind of towards the middle, towards the end, I guess. I like to be involved once I actually have something to play, for sure. But then I like the freedom, especially Betsy's very flexible that way, where I can make suggestions that are more idiomatic or even sometimes just ensemble, especially with the pieces for this album. They're not solos, they're ensemble pieces, and everything changes once you get the people in the room, and being able to mold it still with those other people in that creative process, because I'm more of a collaborator. One of my other hats is an editor. I can write, but I actually feel much better with a partially formed clay, as it were, and then adding my 2 bits. I like to work with things that already exist.
That's definitely something, work that I do as an engineer. I feel that way. And Robert, is that where you like to sort of join the process?
We were just talking about this sort of the writing process. Most of the time they come to me, they'll come to me with, performers and a piece in mind, at which point then I sort of need to join the creative process in terms of trying to decode what I think would translate best in a two-dimensional recording or one, like in stereo. So then you need to sort of decode what you think it sounds like coming off the page and how you are going to position it within a stereo field. And then it comes into play as to what acoustic would best help this music. And so then you're trying to fit all those pieces into some of the decision making. Okay, so this hall would be great, but this hall won't work. This hall has a piano, this hall does not. Do we put the percussion in the center, or do we put the harp in the center? And then you're sort of looking at the lines and seeing how the composer has composed it and where you think some of those lines would best be served in terms of the recording.
Elizabeth, that makes me wonder, so what are you doing when you're in the studio? And, are you having prior conversations with Robert about this? And Jay, do you like to be sort of a producer in the studio? Do you just like to be hands off? Do you just pace nervously back and forth? I do a lot of that. Where do you find yourself fitting in the studio?
I was fascinated. I stood right behind him, and there were certain spots that would make it so dramatic. For instance, the harp in one spot in Bridal Veil Falls. And I wanted it really loud in that spot. Well, he can do that without overshooting,
Right,
and it just made such a difference. It made it so dramatic. Now, if we had a performance, if we were working on it, and I kept saying to the harp, "Can you play that louder? Can you play that louder?" That takes away from it. Whereas he can do it and not annoy anyone, and it just he can do it so beautifully, and he has such control over the sounds. A good technician can do so many things with the sound and make it sound wonderful. Now, mind you, you have to start out with a good performance. But then when you get the good recording afterwards, that's an awful lot to do with the producer. Oh, it's kind of interesting because it started as a piece for flute and tape. And Jay needed something quickly for a grant application. And so I gave her that piece, but she wanted to play with the harp. So I took what I had written for the on the tape, and I rewrote it for harp, part of it. And then, I rewrote the whole thing for harp, tape. I had to reproduce the sounds and flute. And then the woman originally who was going to play harp, her husband was a percussionist. So that's how that started. And I thought, that's a great idea because one of the best sounds is the bass bow and the cymbal. You know that sound?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I love it. There are so many sounds that you can get. They also have a wind machine. All of these things are much better done analog by a person. And they can also do them with expression. And they can go along with the flute and the harp. It's so much better to play with people than a recording. So I wrote a percussion part. And as it ended up, Heidi came and played the harp, and Andy played the percussion. We got together. He brought all his equipment. He has a percussion store, so he had everything.
Brought the whole inventory.
That was about it. He did. He sent me a list of everything he had. It was like a kid in Toyland or something. I could do anything. All of these instruments to play with, and of course he's great on all of them. And the other thing that was really good is he has a sense. He's very musical. He kind of sensed what I wanted. So he would do his own thing sometimes. And I put it in the part. So, I would say, okay, I have too much of this or that or not enough of this or that. And I would put what he did so that the next person that plays it, if it's not him, will do it the same way. So that was kind of a collaboration, actually.
Here was my sort of as a recording question. I wondered, because it felt like everything in the kitchen sink was available, all the tools. Did this pose a problem for you? A problem maybe is a strong word, but a challenge?
No, it was fantastic that she took it to a real percussionist, because there's some of those cymbal swells and things like that just would not have translated as well from let's say a tape per se. The difficulty I didn't find was capturing it. It was really more in the producing and editing part of it, because Andy would approximate some of the things. So, the cymbal roll might not be as loud or might not be as long, or the trail off of a note may be cut off earlier than on another take. And so what would happen was, when you're piecing this together, you'd find that you'd go and splice it with another take, and you'd find, the roll ended on that take, but it's still carrying over on that take, and so I can't use that. But that's where Jay sounded the best.
And Elizabeth, as a composer, does that make you feel excited that the musicians are expressing and
Oh, yeah,
or
definitely.
does that drive you crazy? Because
No,
some
no,
people
no,
are like, play it the way I
No, I would, I have a theory that once the composer's done with it, it goes to the performer. And now, assuming that you have good performers,
Right.
and then it's theirs, then it's their creative energy that goes into making the piece. And that's why people play. I wouldn't never compare myself to Beethoven, but they'll do
Sure.
the same Beethoven over and over, and every time it'll be done differently by different people, and that's what's wonderful about it. I don't want it to be the same all the time.
I really wanted to dissect what you were talking about with the starving artist.
Oh,
'Cause
great.
it is a very interesting term to me.
The
Because
starving artist.
the starving artist, because Jay-Z just got inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
And he, during his acceptance speech, he talked about how much we suffer for our art. And I
Yes.
never think of Jay-Z suffering, because Jay-Z's got billions of dollars.
He has a clothing line.
Yeah,
So,
and but in some ways, when you talk about being a starving artist, I mean, it's a metaphor for, I think, suffering for your art. Now, the question that I find fascinating is, for art to be great, do you need to suffer for it? And in some ways, I almost think that that's the most authentic art that you're going to create, is in some ways if you're suffering for it. Because if you're literally doing it for money and nothing else, you're not putting your authentic self into it, because there is the motivating factor around it is just compensation. And I'm not saying that you can't have compensation, but probably your most authentic self is when you give 18 hours into something that's probably going to pay you for half an hour.
well, but I go back to, and I'll let Betsy speak on this, but I'll go back to what she said earlier about there was a something missing in her life, and not to be too dramatic here, but the composition was something that she was searching for.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I if you talk about how much do I get paid, that's just,
we'll edit that out. Yeah.
Forget it.
It's a good example.
It kind of becomes kind of a joke if someone, especially back then, if someone just mentioned my writing something, I do it, and I couldn't stop myself. So I can't say I suffered. I wasn't, but at the same time, when I've been working on something, I'll be up here working like hours and hours, and I stand up, I can hardly stand up because, I've been in one position for so long. Yeah. And I suffering that way maybe, but not starving, because I have a day job, I'm married, there's quite a difference there. I think if someone was starving and they needed the money, I think that would change things. Then they wouldn't write just because they were driven, they'd have to make a living.
Mm-hmm. So that's really a good point, because it's like the soul is never hungry. You're feeding it the entire time.
Yeah.
It's just that when I say suffering, you are, I mean, we give up a lot. You're spending hours up there because it's at the expense of something else.
Yeah.
And so do we need that? To some extent, I think we kind of do. We need that obsessive, single-pointed focus
Yeah.
that is at the expense of other things, for the art to be as true to our most authentic self as it can be.
Yep.
Well, circling back to some of these pop musicians' first albums, is that sense of urgency still apparent in those recordings? Is that need, that desire, that hungriness, as I think it's often referred to, is that apparent in the earlier albums? And then once you have a clothing line, then you kind of rest on your laurels.
You kind of
so
lose
to
it a
speak.
little, yeah, because you just need to get it out.
I think the ones that stay successful probably hold on to that work ethic, because then it becomes a work ethic as opposed to driven by exterior forces that you're not in control of. You become in control of that motivation. Right. Yeah. My issue with the whole starving artist thing is that it's become kind of a trope, as we know. And so, and that I think has led to musicians and performers being seen as disposable, as we can see by the pandemic. Like, there's so many so many colleagues have left the business altogether because they can't manage, and they're not being supported. Yeah. So I think that trope is feeding a little bit of that lack of respect for the work that all artists are doing.
And I think a business mindset can kind of get pushed into that too, where what is the value of this? Robert, you were mentioning earlier, like, you just like to capture this performance. And the immediate thing I was thinking, just from a pop mindset, I was like, oh, well, it would just be faster to capture it as quickly as possible, and then you can always edit it in post or whatever, something like that. But like, that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because it's about a performance. It's about the interaction of musicians. Perhaps it's not about how quickly or how cheaply we can do it, or what type of profit or returns we can get on our investment. Maybe we're doing it to kind of fill a void, or to feed ourselves, sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively, right?
Part of what I'm doing and why I'm reaching out to people like you and doing a lot of the promotional side and the business side of things is something that a lot of my colleagues, or most of them, we're not taught how to do this, and we don't think to do it, because it's a lot of work to do the marketing side.
Absolutely.
And the classical music, they don't do it. They put out a recording and then it just sort of sits there and molders. And the current music scene doesn't support the way we make music and the way we consume music, like, as 5 movement works, all that kind of thing. It's, people listen differently, but we're still, that's the service we have to cope with now. So I'm trying to blend the two worlds together in some fashion, and that's I think a responsibility that I feel to the artists that have performed for me, to the composers that have written for me, and to everybody's work on this, from the makeup artist to Rob on the board. Like, everybody's put something into it, and I want to honor that with the equal amount of work on the other end. And so it may feel like to some people, some purists, that it's selling out, or why am I doing all this marketing? But it's actually a piece that marketing is really just about awareness. And I want people to know that these pieces are here and play them themselves. And I have a responsibility.
I think your marketing is a talent, though. I think it's a talent equal to what other people do. I'm in awe all the time. I can't get over it. I wouldn't know what to do.
Betsy, can you write the next record for Jay? Can you write 12 3-minute pieces? And then you can just do just 12 singles.
3 minutes? That long? That long?
Like that long.
Wow. Album. That's how I can promote it. That's how I can get it on.
Just
one single at a time.
Yeah, 3-minute classical pieces that are 12 of them. Just write 12 of them.
Yeah.
Can I recommend 2 minutes and a half? Because 3 is really pushing the attention span a bit, I think.
That's how you're supposed to release, is one single at a time, and supposed to draw it out. Like, that's the most success dealing with the current streaming systems that we have, right? Yeah. So that's why I'm interested in actually looking at the NFTs, because then we can actually sell the work direct to the consumer. That interests me.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. It was great speaking with you. So before I let you go, is there a place we can go to find out more about this album and just the music in general that we've heard today on the podcast?
Yes, my website is fluteinthewild.com. and that'll have all the links to downloading the album directly, streaming it on any platform you'd like. There's images. You can download the very beautiful booklet that I had done by Michael Rycraft, and all the credits and information about the pieces are on that website.
And Betsy, where can we go to find out more about you and your music?
You could go to my website, which is elizabethrom.com. That'd probably be the best thing. And then the Canadian Music Center. That's cmccanada.org.
And Robert, can you tell us a little bit about your studio and some of the production you do?
Yeah, I just continuing on, and during, in the pandemic, just doing a lot of live streaming right now. But people can find more about me and the company at societyofsound.ca.
Thanks to Elizabeth, Jay, and Robert for sharing their time and music with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out other episodes in the series. And as always, like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.